discussed single-family homes, and now let's talk about multifamily planned communities, a place where maybe people aren't living in the same home together, but they've decided to live in the same townhouse complex or apartment building together. These are typically purposely built housing, developed with technology and design elements to be more supportive of individuals on the spectrum or with other developmental disabilities. Typically, all of the residents would have accessibility, so if somebody does use a wheelchair, that they'd be able to access all elements very easily in their community. This can be done through private acquisition, so just like a single family home, it can be several families who decide to purchase the property together, or it can be a single investor who then buys and develops the planned community and then rents the different units out or even sells the different units to different people. And there have been groups of families who have been able to have conversations with local developers, talk to them about the need, and then develop their neighborhood based around the way that they want their neighborhood to look and feel and the support needs of those who live there. Typically, in a multifamily planned community, it's completely disassociated from supports. So every individual who lives there may have a different service provider, or they can all have the same service provider. Those are one of the different considerations that you may want to look into. Is only one service provider able to provide services in this planned community? Or if things don't work out with one service provider, can you change service providers in the future? Another really important element is for the individuals, if you're creating one of these multifamily planned communities, is that the individuals who could potentially live there are part of the design and discussion process. That they get to say, you know what, having a pool is really elemental for me. I want to be able to walk out of my front door and have a pool to be able to swim in all year round. Or maybe it would be a greenhouse, or maybe it would be an art studio or a workshop. By creating a planned community, you can build in some of the things that we can't afford to have in our own homes, but that our community as a whole can really be invested in and use. And that just doesn't mean the community within a community, but even the greater community. There's several planned communities that have incorporated dog parks or that have incorporated a community garden. This way it can kind of be a hub for other people to come in and use their facilities as well. Sometimes these type of planned communities can use public funding like HUD funding or low-income housing tax credits to be able to offset some of the future rental opportunities. This way, if public funding is used in addition to the private funding, then essentially over the life of the project, it can be less rent for those who might live there in the future, establishing an affordable housing project within that neurodiverse planned community. So one of the really interesting type of planned communities, multifamily planned communities that are out there, it's called co-housing. And co-housing has had a history here in the US for decades, but it's just recently that the co-housing community, which has architects and planners, have realized that having a neurodiverse co-housing community would be really appealing to a lot of people. A neurodiverse co-housing community is just a neighborhood that was developed by a group of people. In one home, it might be a family who has a child with special needs. In another home, it might be 2 or 3 adults who have autism. In another home, it might be a couple of college students sharing a home with a couple of people of those on the spectrum. In another home, it might just be a neurotypical couple who happen to be interested in living in neurodiverse community. A co-housing community is just a typical neighborhood centered around the fact that you want to be neighbors and be neighborly with those that you live next to. The specific neurodiverse co-housing community that I'd like to highlight is North Street neighborhood in Durham, South Carolina. This was a really interesting project that was started by a couple of church members. They each had children on the spectrum and said, you know, it'd be really cool if we can just live closer together. And so they were looking for houses that maybe they could buy on the same street when one day the founder was driving by this really downridden property that had just square structures, gutted type of homes, multiple of them, 17 of them, all within like a 2 or 3 block radius. And he decided to call his friend, who is a developer, and ask, hey, do you know anything about this property? Coincidentally, this person had just purchased the property in a short sale and said, why are you asking about the property? And through that conversation, the developer decided that he would develop the property at cost for these group of families that were in this church. So it was really a wonderful just coincidence. And I hear these type of miraculous stories all the time. If I can give you one piece of advice, if you're looking to create some sort of planned community or even a single family home option, just talk about it. You don't have to have a plan. Just talk about it, because sometimes the right people come into your life at the right time, and it can make for a beautiful partnership. So very specifically, at North Street neighborhood, all of the houses are owned by different people. And some of the houses are owned by a family member with a disability. Some of the houses are owned by neurotypicals who rent to people with disabilities. Some of them are adult foster care arrangements. 2 of them are what's called friendship houses. And so students from a local divinity school actually share the home with several people with disabilities. When those students from divinity school graduate, they move on, and other students come in and share the home with people with disabilities. So it's a shared living arrangement as well. The area in which they developed the North Street neighborhood was a little bit depressed. I mean, the houses were ugly. They were downtrodden. And so once they started to develop them, they decided that they didn't want to have any gates, that all of the houses were going to have open access and all the common spaces were going to have a purpose. So they have a basketball court in the back of one of the houses. And then the other house, they decided to make a community garden. And what they have found is that neighbors have come into their neighborhood to use the community garden or to play basketball, and that they've been able to have that space to develop neurodiverse relationships. And so they've met neighbors because their neighbor just wanted to come and play basketball, or their neighbor was interested in helping pick tomatoes. And so creating those spaces to build neurodiverse relationships has really increased the integration in the area, but also has just uplifted the spirits of the entire neighborhood. I have to tell you a story about Slayer. Slayer used to live on his own in his own apartment, and he moved to North Street neighborhood. And I asked him, well, what's the biggest difference between you living in your own apartment and you living here at North Street? And he said, in my old apartment, I can ask a neighbor for sugar, and they would give it to me. But here, I can go to them with my hurts and my tears, and they'll stay with me. He's realized the value of relationships in his life and of those natural supports, and has chosen to live at North Street a lot because of that built-in relational community that comes with living in a multifamily planned community. So here's a video of North Street. So in a co-housing community, it really is like a reverse developer role. You build the neighborhood you want, and you already know who your neighbors are going to be even before you rehab the houses or build the houses. So you can create the spaces that your community needs and wants. I think one of the great things about a neurodiverse co-housing community, co-housing has certain elements that have kind of followed through the decades in the traditional co-housing. Some of those elements are they want it to be very pedestrian oriented. And so cars in a traditional co-housing community are actually not part of the greater community. They're parked on the outside, and then walking paths connect the front doors of all of the different homes. This way, say you bring in, your groceries, or you're coming home one day and you're walking to your house, you might, pass somebody and they might be able to say, "Hey, Mary." And it's just that kind of soft social interaction, knowing that people know your name and value you, which provides a sense of community within a community. Some of the other elements is that maybe the mailroom. Maybe people don't have all of their separate mailboxes, but they have a common mailroom. So you have to go and get the mail. Or maybe they have a common laundry area. So you go and get laundry very intentionally to run into people and just have those unplanned. You don't have to invite someone over for dinner. It's just those quick conversations. How was the holidays? How is your family? How is the new, clarinet class that you're taking? Just those soft social interactions that kind of make life really nice. The next multifamily planned community that I'd like to talk to is called Sweetwater Spectrum in Sonoma, California. This was a privately developed community specifically to meet the needs of those on the spectrum. They used a report out of SARC, which did a fantastic job of offering different design elements that make it more conducive for those on the spectrum to be able to live and function in an environment that really meets a diverse array of sensory needs. 16 residents live there in 4 different homes. There's a community center, and there's a pool, and there's a 1-acre greenhouse and a garden area. All the individuals that live there can choose the service provider they want. Sweetwater Spectrum is just the housing. It's just a neighborhood, and just so happens it's just people with autism who live there. Those at Sweetwater who have decided to participate in the gardening and the collecting of eggs from their chickens have now started going down to the locals farmers market and sell their produce. It's not necessarily, a life income type of generating thing, but it's a place for them to be able to bring the produce that they have contributed growing, bring it to their greater community, and that their community values that produce and the work that Sweetwater Spectrum residents are doing, and then they're able to give money back to the residents' pockets. I feel as if that kind of partnership with the greater community is a beautiful thing. It lets the community know who Sweetwater is, while at the same time giving Sweetwater the opportunity to build relationships with those who come to the farmers market every week. Another really neat element of Sweetwater is the way in which they have so many people just walking around at all times. Because everyone has their own service provider, they also probably have a couple of other people hanging out with them. So Sweetwater Spectrum is a bustling place, and there's always somebody to throw a frisbee with, or someone who wants to go in the pool with you, or someone to hang out in the community center. All of the elements of the entire planned community use natural light. They're very, very sustainable in the way in which they heat their property. They have solar panels. They took very big care and concern in the way in which there would be lots of windows to increase accountability. So if you're in the community center, or if you're in your home, and you can see someone walking across that you might want to run out and say hi to. And additionally, they have lots of little nooks that have been placed all around the communities. This way, if somebody wants to be part of what's happening in the living room, they don't necessarily have to be sitting in the couch in the middle of everything. They can kind of sit back in the nook and have that space to be able to interact and then retreat as they desire. They've also done a really good job of making everything look very clean. So there's a lot of storage space where there isn't a lot of clutter all over the walls. It's a lot of natural lighting and neutral tones in which everything is painted, vaulted ceilings. So everything is very open and organized and visually less chaotic. So now that we've talked about multifamily planned communities, let's talk about multifamily planned communities that actually have built-in supports. So the communities that I talked about previously were just the housing. People would be able to rely on natural supports and their service provider to come in. But these next communities that I want to discuss have actual built-in supports. So someone may receive waiver funding, but it's also a supportive housing community where if you don't have a waiver, there's still somebody on site that can help you with things of day-to-day. Maybe you need help being able to figure out how to take transportation somewhere. Maybe you need help being able to understand the application process for a new job. It's just a space that has the built-in support. So if there ever is an issue, you have someone right there, right away, that is going to be able to help you directly. A lot of these planned communities with built-in supports have either been created by a service provider or a group of families working with a service provider. So it's important to understand if that is going to be the only service provider or if you'll be able to use other service providers in that setting. A lot of the built-in supports are more and more using technology. So how can we use technology to create the supports needed for people to self-direct and live more independently? It's one thing to have the support person there, but that means the actual person has to be in your apartment with you at all times. What if there was ways where we can use technology so that you don't have to have a person there, yet if you ever do need help, there's somebody right away that can come in and help you? How do we use technology to increase independence but also decrease the dependence on in-person support? So the first community I'd like to talk about is under construction right now. It's called the Ark Village, and it's in Jacksonville, Florida. There's going to be 68 one-bedroom apartments and 29 two-bath apartments. These are just like any other apartments, except they're going to be on triplexes. So there will be 2 single apartments and 1 double in each of the different units. Individuals will have options of what type of facade they would like to be able to have for their outside of the house. They'll have a little patio area where they'll be able to sit on a front porch. This project uses low-income housing tax credits, and this very specific public investment will actually decrease the need for assistance later in life. So therefore, someone doesn't have to use a voucher. They'll be able to just know that if they decided to move to another home in that community, or if someone somewhere else decided to move into that community, that rent will always be fixed. And here, rent ranges between $250 to $700 a month, depending on whether or not you're going to have a roommate and what unit you want. But in Jacksonville, to find a 2-bedroom apartment for $700 a month is quite a find. So using the low-income housing tax credits has given people the opportunity to, on fixed incomes, to be able to rely on a stable rent if they choose to live in this community. This community can be 80% people with developmental disabilities, and then it's going to be 20% people neurotypicals. The community will have a community center where people can go and ask, let's say, what's called a concierge to be able to help them with different day-to-day activities. There will be planned classes in that community center. So if somebody wants to brush up on their dinner skills, they can go to one of the cooking classes. Or maybe there'll be a Zumba class. Or maybe there'll be an opportunity for people to get together to go to some activity. But when they're not being part of these planned activities, they can choose their own schedule, choose their own provider, and be able to access the community at their leisure. One of the really exciting developments of this community is they wanted to make it accessible for people who have lower incomes. Therefore, the rent is much lower, but they're also going to take into consideration how do we develop partnerships with local community organizations to start decreasing some of the costs. So for example, they're going to have an on-site RN, where if something happens medically, somebody can go and get assistance without having to get a ride to the doctor. There'll be somebody there on-site that can help them with any medical challenges they may be facing. They're also going to have AmeriCorps volunteers that are part of the project. So these AmeriCorps volunteers will be able to organize group activities, and people will be able to participate and not have to necessarily pay for this class or that class. Let's take a look at what future residents have to say about the ARC Village. So Florida has taken a very progressive step forward in creating planned communities for those with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They've actually set aside 5% of all low-income housing tax credits to develop these type of neurodiverse planned communities. And actually, it's a very smart move on the state's part. Let's just say 125 people living over 50 years. If the state were to subsidize their rent in another typical apartment in the community, that could be around $420,000 of subsidies over the course of 50 years for each individual. Whereas if these individuals lived in one of these communities, it would cost the state about $2,000 over the course of 50 years to ensure that there's these units available of affordable housing. And even better, it's part of a neurodiverse community where people can access supports that they need. So it may also even open up waiver slots, because individuals who may not need the higher supports of a group home could actually live in a community like this with the built-in supports without a need for a waiver, which would then open up that waiver slot for another person. So we're very excited to see how these planned communities in Florida continue to develop. There's about 4 of them under construction right now, and we're cheering them on. The next community I'd like to talk about is the Faison Residence. This is located in Richmond, Virginia. It started with the Faison School and a lot of their students graduating into not a whole lot of options. So they decided they were going to build an apartment building. And this apartment building has 1 floor that is specifically for adults with disabilities, and more specifically, adults with autism. Within this apartment building, there's a retail area, and currently Firehouse Subs, Shine Blow Dry Bar, and an urgent care clinic is occupying those spaces. And so it's bringing neurotypicals onto the property to be able to have interface with those who may live there, and then also the individuals with autism that live there have a lot of neurotypical neighbors who know that this community was built specifically to provide the natural supports needed for those with autism who want to live at Faison. The apartments look like any other apartment. They have a community center, it includes a gym, it includes spaces just like any other apartment that you would see in the Richmond area. Rent for the Faison residents, a little bit more expensive than in Jacksonville, is at $1,250 for a 2-bedroom, but that's plus utilities, and then people are able to access their waiver for day support. So whether they go to some sort of supported employment opportunity or if they go to a day program, they use waiver funding specifically for their day supports. And so they pay rent, which includes this built-in supports for the overnight, and then they use supported living or other waiver funding for a day program. Additionally, they have used technology in such a way that they're able to have cameras that are within homes that are not necessarily video cameras, but more track movement. And so there's somebody within the Faison community that is constantly looking at if there has been an irregular tracking of movement within an apartment. So let's say somebody drops something on the floor. It's not too intrusionary. Somebody actually virtually knocks and says, "Hey, are you okay?" And then that person can respond, "Yeah, I'm okay," or "No, I need help." Or if there isn't a response over time, then they know that somebody needs to go and just check on the person. Additionally, they can call on-demand supports. And literally, there is a TV screen that will come out of the wall and say, "Joshua, how can I help you?" And if he had spilt a gallon of milk on the floor, instead of having a support person there kind of rushing over and trying to clean the situation, the person within the video camera knows Joshua and knows the prompts and supports he needs and can walk Joshua through trying to clean up the mess that was made. And then if Joshua needs extra support, there's direct support staff on site that can go ahead and help him. It's just another one of those examples of using technology as a way to decrease in-person support, but also provide kind of that catch just in case someone actually is needed in a situation. They're really trying to not be too intrusive with the technology and allowing for that response of, "Yes, you can come and help me," or "No, I'm okay," or "This might be an emergency, we need to send someone to check up on you."